Yeah. Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of Bible Study That Doesn't Suck, where we are discussing a wonderful new book that just came out. I'm Pastor Megan. I'm at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, www.gracesf.com. And our Bible studies come out most every Wednesday afternoon. And we have joining us our special guest.
Hi, my name's Austen. My name's Austen Hartke. I just wrote that book that Megan was waving around over there. I am, let's see, how should I identify myself? I am a trans guy. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a bisexual guy. So that enters into sort of that was my entry into queer spaces as a teenager. And I'm somebody who likes to study and read about theology. And so I wrote a book about theology that's hopefully pretty easy for everybody to read, whether or not you know anything about theology.
And the back of the book, which I like to look at just so I can show the front of the book, the back of the book says that you went to Luther Seminary.
True, accurate.
And that you won a fancy Old Testament prize, which not very many people can say that.
I know. I love that it's called the John Milton Prize, because that makes you think of, what did he write? Paradise Lost? But it's not that John Milton. It's another John Milton. So go figure.
Some dude who had a lot of money and then got
exactly and gave it to the seminary. Yeah. No, my geeky passion is Old Testament or Hebrew Bible studies. So that's what I do for fun.
So you went to a Lutheran seminary. There's a lot of Wesley in the book. How do you self-identify around faith issues?
So
because I want to claim you as Lutheran, so I'm hoping.
No, I do identify as Lutheran. The Wesleyan parts of it mostly come in. I interviewed M. Barclay, who's Methodist, and then who else in there is in the Wesleyan or sort of Wesleyan tradition of faith? I'm trying to remember. Maybe it's just M in the first or second chapter. But anyways, yeah. So I identify as Lutheran, and it's like I'm a Lutheran that is partially Lutheran because of our ability to argue about stuff and disagree about stuff. So
hooray! I would expect nothing less.
Exactly. My sort of the thing that I hold on to is the fact that my Lutheran confessions class was the only confession in seminary, or the only class in seminary I almost failed because I just kept disagreeing.
I failed systematic theology because I wrote about queer theology, and it seemed like my professor didn't like it, so I went all in. And then later that same article was like published in like an up and coming like theology and then during the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, they put it in Martin Luther's house, like the book.
Oh no.
So I felt really vindicated that like queer theology won, and like it's okay to fail if you want to be right later in history, I guess. But there's a lot of one of the things I really like about your book is there's a lot of interviews that you've done with different kinds of trans people, and so like types or want a broad.
Oh, hold on a second. You just cut out.
I didn't mean. Did I just unfreeze? I think I froze there for a second.
Yeah, you froze for a second. I heard you're saying about interviews. There are lots of interviews, and that's where you froze.
Yeah, there's lots of interviews, and there's lots of diverse types of trans folk. There's lots of diverse types of faith. And I think it's fun because, like, I think Rivers at the Lutheran Seminary in Chicago, and Asher's on the staff member at Proclaim, the leadership group for LGBTQ folk, and Nicole is in there. And Justin Tanis might as well be Lutheran. He's so smart and nerdy, but he's not. But it was a great mix of folk, and I love the way that you kind of combined the casual experience, the casual sacred experience of people with ancient biblical stories. Can you talk a little bit about like that choice?
Yeah, well, I really, one of the things that I feel most strongly about is the importance of being able to see people with experiences like ours in the Bible. And like, it's not a one-to-one thing. We can't be like, that's a person who's trans or that's a person who is gay, because it's not the same. We don't have those same sort of categories back then. But I think it's really important to be able to connect your experience to other people's experiences. And so so when I was at seminary, I did my master's thesis on Isaiah 56 and the passage about welcoming the foreigner and the eunuch. And that was my first introduction to this idea of the importance of connecting stories, because in Isaiah 56, just to like get off on a tangent for a second, Isaiah 56, the eunuchs, God is promising the eunuchs a name that will be better than sons and daughters. And what that's addressing is the fear of these people who at the time could not have biological kids of their own. It was their fear of not being part of the Israelite people, or not being part of the covenant, because they couldn't have kids, which was something that God promised to Abraham as sort of like, you are going to be I'm going to give you children, you know, more than the stars and more than the sand on the beach. And so God was addressing that. So God was connecting the story of the eunuchs to the story of Abraham and Sarah. And that was like a huge thing for me. And then when you go to read Acts 8 and you get the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, you have the Ethiopian eunuch connecting with the story of Isaiah and Jesus and the suffering servant. And so that idea of like connecting stories in the Bible, even within the Bible itself, was really powerful for me. So when I was looking to write this book, I wanted to find ways to connect our experiences to the experiences of people in Scripture, whether it came to like the way we change our names, or whether it came to like how we use gender expression in clothing or things like that. And I really wanted to not only highlight the fact that gender diverse people exist in Scripture, but also that trans Christians exist today and are doing lots of really great stuff. So I kind of wanted to put those things together.
Well, I think it's awesome. And I think we often forget that, like, just because they put together a book and then pushed publish, that it doesn't mean that like Sacred Stories stopped way back then, and that even people who feel like I'm not very special or I'm not very important, I can be in a sacred text at some point. And you really do kind of have the full gamut, from people who are like super fancy pastor folks to people who are feel like they have other parts of the margins that maybe are a part of their story, like River's conversations about mental health issues and stuff.
Yep.
Like that.
Yep. I really wanted to talk about other things that intersect with our identities as gender diverse people. And so I wanted to, like River, especially their story about like, and their conversations about mental illness. And then my friend Aiden's story as a Taiwanese Christian. So as a Taiwanese Christian in Taiwan, he's part of a faith minority, which is something that American Christians don't have an experience of. And so, yeah, I wanted to include as many different perspectives as I could. There are a couple things that, you know, the minute you let go of a book and you send the final thing to your publisher, you're like, oh, I have 20 more things I want to change or fix or whatever. But my main things that I know that the book is missing, that I hope people can build on, is, for one, I didn't talk to any folks who are Catholic. And so having a Catholic sort of perspective is something that I really would have liked to fit in there. And then also perspectives from Black trans women specifically, and because they are at so much higher risk for violence. But that was what caused not being able to get them in the book. I reached out to 3 different Black trans women, and they all said, I would love to share my story, but I don't feel safe doing it. And so that's why they weren't included. And so knowing that they don't exist in this narrative doesn't mean that they're not doing great things. It's just that their safety might be compromised. So.
Yeah, and that says a lot, that like a churchy book for churchy people is a space where people don't feel safe. Sure.
Yeah.
And it's like a book for people who probably are interested in learning more about transness as well. And so there's a lot of work to do. I really appreciated the metaphor of the like mosaic. Is it Taj? I
think it was Taj. No, it was Nicole Garcia. No, wait, hold on. No, it was Lynn. Lynn is the person.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful story that you should read fully, but it's about your life being like scrubbing a floor, and it's very dirty, and you're doing it with a toothbrush, so you just reveal little bits at a time, but it turns out to be kind of this beautiful mosaic, and all of the different parts of your life make up that mosaic. And even if your identity kind of comes out in different stages or in different time frames, that it's still the kind of beautifulness that is you. And I just thought that was a really great metaphor for talking about kind of the messiness that is when and how often people like come out with different parts of their lives. And I think there's this kind of understanding for some people that if you don't like know immediately, or you didn't know, or if your method of like understanding your transness happens differently than a typical narrative, that maybe you're not really trans. And so I just really liked that idea of explaining not only the intersections that everyone carries and how it's beautiful and how it's sacred, but also like if all you have to work with in figuring yourself out is a toothbrush, like, of course you can't figure out like the vast tapestry of what you're going to look back on your life. And
that's a really good way. I hadn't thought about that metaphor in that way, but yeah, if you're using a very small brush, it's going to take a while.
Right? I don't know. Maybe my floor is messier than others, so I just
no, I think that's accurate for a lot of people.
yeah.
That's actually one of the biggest, like when I go to churches and I do sort of like gender trans stuff 101, that's one of the biggest things that is hard to explain to folks, because there's this misconception sometimes that trans folks are like gay people 2.0. Like you start out as gay and then you become trans. And so because a lot of people find language for their sexuality before they find language for their gender. And so for some people that is the sort of arc. But then I get all these folks who are like concerned because their child just came out as gay, and does that really mean that eventually they're going to be trans? And I'm like, no, that's not how that works. But it's hard to figure out because we have a very small brush.
Yeah. And I'm not only trans myself, but I have a child who is trans, and the like fear that I have for their life and how small their brush is and how much of their life is unveiled right now is a completely different part of my brain. And you would think I would be better at it because it's like part of my own journey, but so many trans journeys are just completely different and like a choose your own adventure in so many different ways that it's like, it's almost just, it's like throwing up your hands and just being like, well, let's see what happens, which is, I think you relate a lot to kind of how God feels during the act of creation. And there's kind of this, you can think of God as like the puppet master who's like pulling, you can think of God as like just as delighted to see what happens kind of as we are. And so I think there's a beautiful, I don't know, if you kind of have the ability to step back and just be like, whoa, like, who knew bodies could stretch like this or hormones could change like this, and what my brain can do now. Like for me, it lends me an opportunity to think of the Imago Dei, not just as our like manifesting what God is up to in the world and what God looks like, but also like the joy and the patience of God to just be like, okay, like you're going to do that now. And I think Asher talks about that a little bit, like in talking about like wounds and scars and the way that like Asher truly believes that God made them for that journey. Like it was tough and dumb in some ways, but like that whole process was a part of that creation of God and was a beloved way to go through it. And so I just thought that was a kind of a beautiful way to let people unravel their own stories and different opinions.
I was really, when I talked to M. Barclay, that was one of the main things that I took from their story, is that they were talking about, because that's the chapter where we talk about the Imago Dei. And so like this Old Testament scholar, Terence Fredheim, who I actually got to take classes from at Luther, he's wonderful. But his whole thing about about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, just both creation stories, is that God is in this power sharing relationship with us, with humans. And so we are created as co-creators with God. So just what you were saying about like, we get to create things and do things, and God gets to be like, wow, I didn't think, like, not, I mean, saying God was thinking like, I never thought of that, but like, that's kind of the surprise sort of element that comes with it that I think is really nice. But then M. Barclay kind of going one step further and saying like, as people created in the image of God, we are therefore also created with that creative urge. And so if we're not using our creativity to make life better for everybody and to create new things in the world and find new things, find new ways of being in the world, then we're not fully living into that image of God that we are created to be. And that was something that I just thought was wonderful, taking it that step further as like, we are intentionally made to create and change things.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for folk who like live in parts of the country that maybe are less supportive of their fullness of their being, or like ways that they can read the Bible in a way that's going to help them kind of build a resilience?
That's a really good question. I think, I mean, my first instinct is always that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to be a Christian on your own because we're made to be in relationship with other people. And so it really sucks when you feel like you're in a place where you physically can't connect with other folks because of just like where you live. And so I always try to get people to reach out and do stuff like this online, where it's like you can be in relationship with other people, even if you can't be in the same physical space.
Yeah.
When it comes to like reading text and reading scripture, I think one of the most helpful things for me has been reading books by people who exist in other marginalized spaces and exist with other marginalized identities. So not necessarily even like queer theology stuff, but like Black theology stuff and disability theology and places where people are coming at scripture from a completely different perspective because they see things that I would have never seen. And that helps me connect with scripture because it helps me know that other people are connecting with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's definitely themes that kind of run through different kinds of liberation theologies that people have been able to take up and models ways that people can find their own liberation as they move into the future with whatever identities kind of pop up into the world. And you also, in addition, having your new book out, I have to do it because otherwise it's cheesier if you do it.
Well, yeah, that's true. If I do it, I'm just kind of like, buy the thing.
Yeah. So in addition to this book that's come out, you've also for a while been doing a YouTube series, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I started doing that right after I graduated from seminary because I was working a day job that didn't use my degree at all. And I thought, I got to use this for something. And really, there was two kind of impetus for the video series. One is feeling like I just paid a ton of money to learn all this stuff academically, and I wanted to make that available to people that couldn't afford to go to seminary because it's a lot of money. And so I wanted to try to make that as accessible to people as I could. The other sort of spark there that started it is when I was coming out as trans. So I started my coming out process in my final year of seminary, but I didn't officially come out until I graduated and they handed me the piece of paper because I was afraid they wouldn't hand me the piece of paper otherwise. Yeah, so I waited till right after I came out, but then or right after I graduated, but I started coming out to my family, and I had a conversation with my dad one night, and he was like trying to wrap his mind around how I could be trans and also have just graduated from seminary and have all these beliefs. He like couldn't make that connection. And so he kind of started asking me questions about like, well, what about this verse? And how do you understand this theological concept? And I realized that there wasn't a place where all of those questions were being asked in a accessible way for everybody. And so I started, at first I was like, maybe I should write a blog. And then I was like, I don't know how to do this well. And I realized that the place where I was going to see most trans narratives was YouTube, because people were documenting their transitions, and like lots of trans folks were doing that. And so I thought, well, I'll just do it here where everybody already is. So I started making videos, and it started out just kind of looking at like the clobber passages. But the thing is, there are really only 3-ish passages in the Bible that people really use against trans folks specifically. There just really isn't that much. Unless you're extrapolating a lot. So I started with those, but then I realized like very quickly that I wanted to go on to talk about more issues about like, instead of just defending ourselves, you know, how can we move on to seeing ourselves more clearly? How can we move into becoming active participants in the church itself as we are, and addressing issues of like how might we make our churches better places, and sort of the agency that we have as well. Because I think I worry a lot about folks like in queer Christian circles, because even still we're working as a marginalized population that often is getting beat up. And I don't mean to like downplay that at all, but I worry about us moving eventually into a point where maybe we are more accepted, but holding on to that victim mentality, which can be really damaging. Like we see that in Christianity all the time, this holding on to like, well, we're Christians and we're constantly being persecuted, but really we're not. So yeah. I hope that we can
not from that larger global perspective. No.
Exactly right. And so I worry that we might hold on to the victimhood that we have now too long in the future. And so I want us to press into what agency we have to make things better for everybody.
I appreciate the writing that you've done. I appreciate the videos that you've done, and I appreciate you getting that word out there. And particularly as someone who has a lot of privilege as someone who's a part of a Lutheran church that kind of celebrates me and a congregation that celebrates me. And I get a lot of opportunities. It's really nice to be able to have thinkers who are out there who are working to like lift up voices that aren't getting as much attention, and who are thinking about those diversity issues and thinking about those intersection issues. And I think it's a really lovely time to be trans and to be a faithful person, because I think there is in some spheres, like within the Lutheran church, where they're like, yay, trans stuff, let's be nicer to them than previous people who we've made have to prove their entry ticket into the space. And so it's the gift of trying to figure out how to be faithful people, how to introduce ourselves to people who may have never have heard of us before, how to recognize ourselves as beautiful and sacred in God's eyes, and or maybe like reveal the stuff in the Bible that was already there, but people kind of stopped noticing it for a little while. And it's I think an opportunity, I hope, for future groups that people forget have always existed, to do theology kind of without that apology, but also to find ways to like, how are we gracious when other people have to learn about our identities, at the same time that we don't have to diminish ourselves in the eyes of God, or we don't have to say everyone's welcome and everyone's loved by God, but can you please debate your way in, because I really don't get you. And so I appreciate people who are kind of helping to figure out what that looks like in this kind of trans world, and especially excited that a Lutheran's doing it too.
Yeah, I feel really strongly that we are all, we're all given different gifts. And so I think some people are really gifted to doing the work of pushing forward and like stretching people in good ways. And other people are more gifted for the bridge building between the people that don't get it and the people that, do get it. And so I hope we all can like live into those different gifts and not have to feel like everybody has to be doing one kind of work.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. I'll just wrap this up and say, I'm really appreciative. I thought it was a great read. It seems like a book that works on a lot of different levels. Like as a trans person, I could like skip the chapter about definitions and then kind of go on to some other stuff. But I also felt good that like other people who are going to read it who didn't know all of that stuff, that I wouldn't maybe have to teach them about that later.
Right.
And so when someone's like, tell me all the things about yourself, I could just say, read this book instead.
Yeah.
Exactly. So thank you again for all the work that you've put into this book, and I hope it gets enough success that you can write a couple follow-ups to it.
Thank you. I would love to. That would be great.
All right. Well, I'm going to sign us off then.